Good morning, everybody. My name is Adam Blackwell, the Vice President, International Development Services Group. And on behalf of the entire team of the Global Terrorism Trends and Analysis Center, I will be moderating this session titled The Survival and Evolution of Islamic State, Khorasan. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. The views expressed are those of the presenters in this case. Dr. Amira Jadoon is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Clemson University. Prior to joining Clemson, Jadoon worked for the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, jointly appointed in the Department of Social Sciences and Combating Terrorism Center from 2017 to 22. Amira specializes in international security, political violence, and counterterrorism strategies, and co-author with a new book, The Islamic State in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Strategic Rivalries and Alliances, published by Lynn Reimer. And I think, if I'm correct, colleagues, this book is now on sale, so it would be opportune to try and buy it. In 2022, the Center of Strategic and International Studies named Dr. Jadoon as one of the 50 honorees in the U.S. National Security and Foreign Affairs Leadership List. Andrew Mines is a program specialist in the Asia Center at the United States Institute of Peace, and before joining USIP, he was a research fellow with the program on extremism at the George Washington University. Each presenter will speak for roughly 15 minutes, and then we'll have another 15 minutes for discussion. So please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and I would ask everybody to try and make your questions concise and precise so that we can get as many answers in as possible. So Dr. Jadoon, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Adam, very much for that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Andrew and I are very excited about the release of our book earlier this year, and to have this opportunity to discuss some of our findings on ISK from the book, but also from additional work that we have done on the organization. Next slide, please. So in general, we'll try and keep it as concise as possible, but we'll start out with providing you with an overview of our book's the main puzzle, our key argument, and our findings. We'll then shift our focus to discussing some of the key changes that we have observed in ISK's operational behavior, such as how its targeting priorities have changed, how some of its operational trends have changed in terms of location, their frequency, all of which give us a good idea of how ISK has been adapting its strategy since the Taliban's takeover, essentially over the last 2 years. And then finally, to conclude our discussion, we'll talk about some of the recent efforts on part of the Afghan Taliban to constrain ISK's behavior, specifically at the start of this year. And we want to discuss what that may mean for ISK's trajectory in the future and whether these efforts can be sustained. Next slide, please. All right, so as you can see along the timeline here, ISK first emerged in 2015, right? Essentially extending Islamic State's goal of creating a caliphate into South and Central Asia. But at the time of its emergence in 2015, ISK faced a lot of challenges, which led many to doubt that it would be able to create space for itself. Now, what were some of these challenges? The landscape is generally, it hosts a number of militant groups. So ISK was facing a lot of competition from sectarian groups, from anti-state, ethno-nationalist movements, state-linked groups. So it really had to compete with all these other actors in its environment. At the same time, the war in Afghanistan was still ongoing. We had a US-led NATO, US-led coalition force fighting the Afghan Taliban. And at the same time, we have the Pakistani military on the other side of the border, which has also by this time gotten pretty good at conducting counterterrorism operations. And this region was already host to Al-Qaeda, right? Islamic State's main global opponent. So it had a number of challenges at the outset. Yet now that we think to the current time, ISK is essentially in its 9th year of existence. So what's become really clear is that ISK has this tendency to revive itself, but also it has a really tenacious grip in the region. So the motivating question for our book, which is also relevant again to revisit, given that ISK resurged upon the US's withdrawal, some of the questions that motivated this book are still relevant today. And these are what really explains ISK's rise, but also its continued survival. And more specifically, what has enabled ISK not only to compete with militant groups such as the Afghan Taliban, but also survive CT operations. So as you can see in the timeline here, ISK not only managed to create space for itself, it became one of the deadliest organizations in the world in 2018, just a few years later. Subsequently, we saw a lot of losses that it faced, which we'll talk about in a second. But again, we see it make a comeback in 2022 as one of the deadliest organizations in the world again. So really, what explains Islamic State's rise, but its endurance and resilience in these two countries. Next slide, please. All right, so in seeking to answer this bigger question, we posed a number of smaller questions to really get to this bigger answer, right? So first of all, we examine the evolution of ISK's operational capacity and its strategy in the face of counterterrorism operations, and also its losses due to these operations, and in addition, its clashes with the Taliban. We look at data from these CT outcomes to look at ISK's leadership structure and its militant base. And then we really dig deeper into the specific ways and mechanisms through which ISK's alliances and its rivals have really contributed to its capacity, resurgence, and its general survival. So we relied on a number of different sources to write this book. So we have our own original data sets on ISK's operational activities, but also its territorial and leadership losses and militant losses. We had access to documents relating to the organization, which were discovered in Afghanistan. So that gives us really great insights into the connections between ISK and IS Central, for example. And then finally, we also use primary materials, propaganda, et cetera, and other secondary literature. Next slide, please. All right, so before we move to the operational trends, I want to present my main argument up front. So within this book, what we argue is that to create space for its brand and its organization, ISK essentially adopted a two-pronged approach, which simultaneously relied on building a network of cross-border alliances, but also at the same time, provoking dominant groups in the region intentionally as key rivals. And we argue that this approach, which is still relevant today, has really been fundamental to ISK's strategy to localize its jihad and build an infrastructure which it can replenish continuously. So on one hand, ISK first took advantage of various sectarian anti-state groups across Afghanistan and Pakistan. It established operational links with such groups. So one of the prominent groups is Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. And then it has continued to draw on these links to sustain itself and project power. Now, on the other side, we see ISK intentionally provoking dominant groups in the region, but most notably, of course, we have seen this with the Afghan Taliban, and this has continued since ISK's origin, but also in the current period. And we see that this rivalry with with the Taliban has really paid ISK with dividends, which is allowing it to become a regional organization, which has been one of its revised goals in the post or in the Taliban era. Next slide, please. All right, so this figure here actually draws on our original data sets, and it comes from our book. So you can see that upon arrival in 2015, ISK's operational activities escalated rapidly up till 2017 and 18. But then after an intense counterterrorism operation effort by primarily by the US, but also operations in Pakistan, we see a significant decline in 2019. And this is the time period when most observers of ISK, as well as various policymakers, considered ISK to be largely a defeated organization. Next slide, please. So here, this slide here shows you ISK's operational activity starting in 2020, right? So I just mentioned that 2019 was when we saw significant operational declines, and ISK also lost pretty much all of its territorial control. But in 2020, we also started seeing a quiet resurgence where ISK's goal now, without the same strength, without the same territorial control, was to remain relevant. So against the backdrop of the US and the Taliban initiating negotiations, we see ISK take an approach where it's become more brutal. It starts lashing against civilians to create more casualties, but also to remain relevant in this very competitive environment. We see the appointment of a new leader, al-Muhajir, who seems to be more of a visionary leader compared to past ones, and he's also the one who has survived the longest. And there have been significant changes in ISK's strategy since his appointment, which kind of are clearly depicted in this figure over here. Next slide, please. Now, moving away from ISK's operational strategy, which Andrew will discuss its current posture after this slide, actually, the last point I want to discuss is ISK's media and outreach and how it has evolved since its emergence. So if we examine the evolution of ISK's propaganda campaign, it provides us really interesting insights into how ISK adapts based on changes in its environment, but also its internal organizational goals and also its strength at that moment in time. So in general, we identify 3 key waves in how ISK has conducted outreach activities. And these 3 waves capture its shifting priorities and its strategic environment. So during the first phase, when ISK was trying to create its brand in the region, and it was starting to control territory or pockets of territorial control, we see a lot of references in its propaganda, which relate to life in the caliphate, right? Depicting life in ISK-controlled territory in an attempt to create its new reputation as a new organization, but also to poach militants from other groups and attract new talent. What we see consistently is the very strong anti-Taliban theme, which is intentional throughout the 3 waves. Now, the second wave is when ISK goes into survival mode. So I talked about how in 2019, we see a significant decline. And here we see ISK's propaganda shift more towards linking the Taliban clearly to the US, calling it more of a puppet, right? All in an attempt to undermine the Taliban. And we start seeing ISK trying to portray itself as the main alternative to the Taliban, which are deemed to be nationalists and not even really true jihadists or representatives of the Muslim community. Now, the third wave is what we're seeing right now, and this is the wave which has emerged after the US's unconditional withdrawal and the subsequent takeover by the Taliban. So the group's outreach and propaganda dissemination in this final wave has really reached levels that we have not seen before in terms of the quantity, quality, and the number of languages that it's providing or disseminating propaganda in. And beyond vilifying the Taliban, a lot of its messaging now highlights state repression against Muslims in the area, right? So in China, in India, and Pakistan, across Central Asia. And here now, ISK, with its goal of becoming a regional organization, is really trying to expand its audience segmentation within its messaging, right? Which is an indication of its motivation to become a more regional organization. So within this campaign, what we're seeing is a lot more sophistication, a lot more timely commentary on what's going on, and of course, an intense vilification of the Taliban as it has done so in the past. And with that, I'll stop and I will hand it over to Andrew to discuss some of the operational changes that we have observed in ISK's behavior and what those may mean, and tell us about the group. Next slide, please, and Andrew.
Thanks, Amira, and thank you all for being here this morning. I will shamelessly say right now, this is a great time to buy the book. We're going to give you a preview, as Amira has already done, on some of the data and research that's in there. But the book is 40% off right now. There's also rental programs for students starting from $20 and others. So please take advantage of those resources as you can. We'll make sure the links are distributed. I'm going to quickly talk through 2 years of ISK under the Taliban. I'm going to talk through some of the shifts in ISK operations that we've seen, a really expansive profile that I'll show on the next slide, and then also some Taliban efforts to counter ISK, what we've seen, some lessons learned from the previous period under the former government, and just think through some of the consequences at the end there. So next slide, please. This period has been one of the most expansive, and perhaps the most expansive period in terms of the range of operations ISK conducts and has conducted since its formation in 2015 officially. This list is not exhaustive, by the way. It doesn't even cover external operations and plans, one that we've already seen against a US and NATO bases in Germany in 2020. More recent developments, especially between the Discord leaks, but also reports from several EU countries of ISK operatives reaching out to communities in their countries to plot attacks. And so this doesn't even cover that, but you look solely at regional and in-country activity on ISK's behalf. Look, this is quite expansive. Economic warfare, as the Islamic State global movement defines it, their words. Those are operations of an insurgency attacking critical infrastructure targets. In ISK's case, electricity pylons and oil tankers servicing urban communities. Attacks on the international community and foreign nationals and NGOs. We've seen multiple attacks on different embassies over the last couple of years, last year certainly. Growing campaign previously had been kind of targeted messaging individually to different INGOs and IOs, but growing more into their propaganda and potentially trying to close the gap on what they're saying with actual violent action against international organizations and those still servicing the country. So campaign against humanitarians in particular. High-profile assassinations. ISK has always been ambitious on this front. Plots against NATO, the top leaders of NATO, our top U.S. diplomat in the region, the former president of Afghanistan and the former government. Dr. Abdullah and others have all been targets of ISK in the past, but this recent period, a lot more success in going after top Taliban officials, or trying to at least. Then more of the historically stronger points of the ISK insurgency, certainly what they enjoyed in previous years at their height around 2016, 2017, certainly a bit in 2015, in terms of competing in rural areas and grinding through the day-to-day operations of an insurgency that targets convoys on the road, that targets checkpoints and security personnel, mostly around their historical strongholds in Nangarhar province. Also, a campaign of violence, mostly in Kabul, expanding to other cities, certainly, early on, but this has been long what ISK has perpetrated as its campaigns of violence in different cities across the region. Kabul, Jalalabad most prominently of those in Afghanistan. And finally, to Amir's point about the regional aspects of the organization, really trying to push the bounds of the province and push that regional strategy by claiming attacks in Uzbekistan, in Tajikistan, a long time in Pakistan, but certainly still there, and Iran too. So really trying to, under the Taliban's rule, push out what ISK is and draw in that regional recruitment strategy through cross-border attacks. So across the board, a really expansive campaign. Next slide, please. Where is this happening? Really, if you look in the top left in black, those are the two provinces, Nangarhar and Kunar, where ISK historically has enjoyed the most support and considers its strongholds. Kabul is its operational area, its key operational area, so certainly not controlling territory, obviously in Kabul, but one of its core operational areas where a lot of its operatives are based too. But expanding it over this last 2 years north towards the Central Asian countries and re-expanding and doubling down east towards the tribal areas in Pakistan, where a lot of ISK's founding contingents originated. So really pushing out and on both fronts and trying to, like I said, expand the boundaries of what the insurgency is able to do, where they're operating, and then also the networks that come with pushing out and expanding your area of operations. The bottom right is a depiction of, and this is interesting, I think it's interesting to compare where ISK and reported Al-Qaeda training camps, safe houses, and other positions are currently reported from member states and by the UNSC analytical team. And so you can see, again, painting that northern border with the Central Asian countries in terms of being able to facilitate both cross-border attacks, yes, but also that campaign to bring in foreign fighters. And then in the east, of course, where they've historically enjoyed support. So really, this is an expansive period. Next period, slide, please. What have the Taliban done about this? At the start, right after they took over Kabul and took in August 2021, we saw a really violent campaign. I'm sure many on this call will be familiar with the violence that was perpetrated in communities that ISK has, yes, historically enjoyed support, but where the Taliban saw the biggest ISK threat immediately around Nangarhar, and particularly in Jalalabad in the wake of their takeover. And so some really awful human rights violations and really brutal crackdowns against the local population. Since then, not as much reported in international outlets, certainly. But this recent period in 2023, from February to May, a number of notable successes reported from the region as the Taliban is facing pressure to commit or hold to their commitments on counterterrorism, their so-called commitments on counterterrorism, at least. And so pushing through multiple successful targeting operations against top ISK leaders, not the topmost, but right underneath in that cohort of leaders, certainly. So a range of successes. How sustained that is, we haven't seen much reported since. So some questions over the sustainability, whether that's a capacity or interest question, maybe we can have a debate on that, but not much sustained in that front. And so next slide, please. One thing that, and this is a study that Dr. Jadoon and I put out with our colleague, Dr. Daniel Milton, in the Journal of Conflict Resolution last year, which is how can we think about, okay, leadership targeting as a part of a counterterrorism strategy? Where does it fit in, and how can we think about, yes, how it dampens the organization over time, but also the short-term effects of what does leadership targeting actually do to a group like ISK? And what are the short-term effects of what leadership targeting is able to achieve? So we looked at hundreds of leadership losses in ISK over the years. This is under the previous Afghan government when the coalition was still taking on a lot of targeting operations against ISK. And so we broke those out in controlling for geographically the same area where an ISK leader was targeted. And we broke those down across different levels. You'll notice that this is oftentimes aggregated just to the top leadership level, but we broke that down into different levels of leadership. So in the same area, the week after an ISK leader is targeted, how does the group respond? What is its operational response? And so next slide, please. What we found is overall, when you don't disaggregate for leadership level, when you just take it overall, actually in the week afterwards, total numbers of attacks go up. So the group's short-term operational response to suffering leadership losses is to respond with violence. Next slide, please. But when you break that out, there's actually a little bit more nuance in there in terms of when you target different levels of ISK leadership, there's a convincing argument that, at least what we hope is a convincing argument that we present with data, is when you look at that second level of leadership right underneath the top leader. We're talking about leaders on the consultative council for the top leader, heads of the different bureaucratic departments that ISK stood up, leaders of major urban area operations, and others. Actually, there's a bit of a dampening effect, both on total attacks, but also when you look at who they're targeting. state and civilian targets alike. So there's a convincing argument to be made that when you look at that period of after an ISK leader right under that top leadership level is targeted, it's a convincing argument to be made that you'll see a dampening effect on ISK operations across a number of domains. But when you look at the lowest level of ISK leadership, those that are really responsible for the day-to-day operations of the organization, it's almost the opposite. Total attacks go up in the week afterwards, especially the response against civilian targets. So again, a convincing argument to be made that when you go after those low-level leaders, the group does respond with very quickly and severely with violence against civilians. So some interesting insights that might be applicable to this period. Again, very different environments, very different security environments, of course, but certainly some lessons learned from this data. Next slide, please. And so we just wanted to conclude and again really encourage folks to take advantage of the book as a resource, because we go through a lot of these in more detail, but thinking through some of the other approaches that the international community really has to lean on more now without that major in-country presence from NATO and particularly US air assets. And so when we think about how we can coordinate a regional response to what is a regionally aspirational organization like ISK that has been regionally aspirational since its founding. Coordinating with regional partners, whether it's multilateral, bilateral, different partners and forums. How can we support partners in Central Asian countries, Pakistan and others, to deal with this rising threat? How can we support inter-regional forums and coordination between those countries as well, and identify those key transnational risks like the migration of fighters across borders, foreign terrorist fighter flows, like the operations of cross-border networks that ISK drew on, as Amira discussed in the first half of the presentation. So working through those problem sets as a regional approach. When it comes to strategic communications, these are really lessons learned both from the fight against ISK historically, but also from the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria too, which is, this is a movement that says a lot of things and tries to keep that gap between what it says and what it does very limited. But there are key areas where you can come in as a strategic communicator and do some real work on the organization in terms of leadership turnover, in terms of leaders abandoning the rank and file of the organization. We saw this in waves after the fall of Mosul and Raqqa and other areas in Iraq and Syria where IS leaders were just, cut and run, and it was their fighters, their women and children who were left to suffer the consequences. And so thinking through some of those campaigns, those messaging campaigns as applicable to this theater, especially when it comes to leadership turnover and changing what ISK perceives to be a strength, which is its regional cohort, all these different ethnicities and nationalities of its fighters making up its ranks. In years past, that had actually been a point of struggle for the organization. In the book, we go through many examples of ISK leaders of different ethnicities and nationalities vying for control in the organization when the top leader was killed or captured, and then the question of leadership succession came in. So some interesting insights from the book, certainly, and hopefully for strategic communicators, some ideas might flow. And then finally, I mean, we are still very much active as an international community, of course, in Afghanistan, the US more so than any partner. Humanitarian aid, what role does that have to play? Where are the biggest real threats from ISK? Thinking about policies and procedures if you are an INGO or an IO, and assessing the ISK-linked threat and making sure that your posture as an organization has crisis response mechanisms in place, is updating those. But also thinking through, this continues to be a dire humanitarian situation for the population, multiple populations in Afghanistan. Thinking through how ISK is going after different populations that are suffering right now, and thinking through, well, what can the international community do if the Taliban is not willing to step in and support those populations, which has just not been the case in a lot of areas where ISK is vying for control. So thinking through those questions, they're not easy questions. There's no quick answer, of course, but certainly starting to have those conversations would be vital. With that, we'd love to hear from you all. We've got, I think, 15 minutes or so. Adam, sir, I'll turn it back to you, but thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Amira and Andrew. And yes, we have about 15 minutes left for questions. I have a few already. So please prepare your questions, enter them into the Q&A function in Zoom, and we will get right at it. The one I do have, Andrew and Amira, is can we share the PowerPoint with the audience later? If that's okay, just let me know, and we'll make sure everybody gets it. The first question is really around the economy of ISIS-K. So, do they poach solely for ideological reasons, or is it more for economic survival? And I guess a secondary piece to this is, where do they get their money? Is it organized crime? Is it coming from ISIS core? Where are they raising their funding to continue their operations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll answer the piece about recruitment first. So in all of our analysis, looking at different types of activities related to ISK and also its propaganda, it's very clear that ISK is very open to the recruitment of either religiously motivated individuals or those who may be joining because they have grievances against their host governments, or for practical reasons because ISK perhaps pays their commanders a higher amount than other groups, right? So in its recent propaganda, but also its earlier, you can see that there's a lot of religious justification for its actions, but at the same time, it's also appealing to practically oriented individuals, right? So you see both ideological based recruitment and also other incentive based recruitment. In terms of ISK's money, so a lot of it comes from donations, and now we know that there's also cryptocurrency involved. We have to remember that the region in which ISK is based is very conducive to militant groups' ability to raise funds for themselves. So there's a vast literature which shows how border issues, right, gaps in security in border, but also having a large shadow economy along with high levels of corruption is all very conducive to militant groups channeling or exploiting channels of smuggling, which is likely what's happening here. And I think you kind of noted that in the question that ISK does get money. We have evidence from at various points of time where IS Central has provided funds to ISK, and even at the current moment, it is. Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to add something to that.
Only 2 points, which is just I think there's a lot of focus on the recruitment when it comes to poaching members from different militant groups. Also need to think through cooperation. A lot of what we have seen and what we go through in great detail in the book and are continuing to see is they may not necessarily be poaching members entirely and bringing them in from rival organizations or even organizations that share a lot of ideological compulsions with ISK, but cooperation on a number of domains. And so thinking very carefully through, maybe this fighter on day X is working for this organization. Lots of instances where on day Y, they'll be working with that organization for ISK or jointly cooperating or jointly claiming things. So I just want to be very, very, very clear on that as well. On the funding side, the only thing I'll add is that this is actually a really unique period internationally for the Islamic State as a global movement, where the mandate from the core leadership in Iraq and Syria is for its provinces to be self-sufficient. And I think ISK is a fantastic case study from an academic perspective of a province within the global movement that has done a really good job of cementing itself to be independent from the core.
Here's another question from our own Dr. Cengiz, who works at GTEC. We have failed to predict the notable attacks by jihadist groups, whether it be 9/11, the 2015 Paris attacks, and the more recent Hamas attacks on October the 7th. So here, do you think that ISIS-K is a local or a global threat? And could ISIS-K be a perpetrator of a notable attack in the future? And any policy recommendations for counterterrorism experts? That's a compound question.
That is a great
three
question.
different
And Andrew, do you want to talk about the international piece and then I can add to it?
Sure thing. Thank you. Look, ISK has global ambitions. I think we've seen a growing number of indicators that show its global ambitions since 2020, at least, probably well before that. ISK has drawn fighters from over a dozen nationalities, from France to the Philippines. A couple of folks from the United States, UK, Australia have all tried to join this organization. So this is a global organization with the potential to rival what the Islamic State was able to do. This is also mirrored in where their propaganda overall, as propaganda operations, are heading. I think one thing for counterterrorism experts to look at would be within its with limited intelligence capabilities by our own intelligence community's admissions. One of the things that IS as a global movement do, and lessons learned from Iraq and Syria, is it's always this combination of legacy fighters from other conflicts mixed in with key influencers and ideologues of either Western origins for Western countries or other nationalities for other countries that are active and pushing out propaganda in Islamic State outlets. In ISK's case, certainly the Voice of Khorasan, we're seeing Canadian, Italian, and other claimed foreign fighters starting to push out more actively in those outlets. And so thinking through those key nodes of influencers and then legacy fighters and how they have historically, whether it's Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, for decades now, spearheaded those global operations and pushed what would otherwise be a local terrorist or insurgency group to pursue those international objectives. Amira, over to you.
Yeah, I think Andrew covered a lot of ground on that question. The only thing I would add is, yes, it's a local threat, obviously, but it's increasingly showing the potential to become a global threat, right? And there's two ways it can do that. One is it can start launching attacks from Afghanistan, which is what is unlikely. I think what is more likely, or there's the higher risk, is that ISK starts to reach out to individuals who are already based in the West, right? So they don't have to do any traveling, but they leverage the virtual planner model and provide instructions to any individuals who may be sympathetic towards ISK's mission in Afghanistan. And there have been a couple, well, more than a couple reports of individuals arrested in Turkey, in the UK, in the Netherlands, where either they were planning to travel. There was a case of two, I think, brothers in the UK who had filled out ISK forms and were planning to travel to Afghanistan, right? So I think that's the real risk when it comes to Western countries, is ISK's potential ability to recruit sympathizers way beyond South and Central Asia, and then potentially linking these individuals with each other, which we haven't seen a lot of evidence of. But again, we can't let our failure of imagination to come in the way of potentially preparing ourselves for such threats. I'll stop there. We can go to our next question.
So our next question is actually one of the benefits of doing these presentations by Zoom. I perhaps can answer it myself. It's Amit Kumar, a PhD student, a candidate student from India, and her research deals precisely with the Afghan-China relations. And she is asking if you would be willing to speak with her for 20 minutes to help her with her research. And if that's a thumbs up, Amit, I would suggest you put your email in the chat, and I will make sure the connections happen. The next question is, how was the process of data collection for the book? How much was open source? What were the issues? You know, we have challenges in certain areas where there isn't a lot of media. So a little bit about your data collection process would be useful.
Yes. So, so as you know, whoever studies covert organizations like terrorist groups or insurgent groups, getting reliable data is always a challenge, whether you are using open source or even when you're interviewing militants, right? There's always a reliability issue. So to mitigate that, as I showed in my second slide or third slide, we intentionally leveraged a number of resources so that we would be able to corroborate, but also we didn't want to be overly reliant on any one source. So our data sets on ISK's attacks and losses are coming from the open source, right? But we had the advantage in the process of writing this book. I was still based at the U.S. Military Academy, so we have a lot of constant discussions and engagement with actually people who were deployed in Afghanistan or were working on the policy at the time. So we were constantly sort of checking and using these sources as a soundboard to make sure that we're on the right track. So that helped us gain more confidence in these large data sets that we labored over to collect. Additionally, since I was also at West Point at that time, we had access to documents which were declassified, and these documents were recovered from Afghanistan and they belong to ISK. So most of them, the vast majority, is correspondence or reports from ISK to IS Central. So this was a really rich source of data that we had access to, but this was limited to the early years of ISK. We also obviously had access to all of the propaganda materials of the group, which we again also used to complement our other work, and then various other secondary academic research to round it off. So,
Excellent. The next question is, there was a pause in attacks in March of 2023 in Afghanistan. Is this only due to the Taliban's counterterrorism operations, or is there another reason for this pause?
I would stress first that a lot of analysts and officials have pointed to this as evidence of ISK's demise. Remember that slide Dr. Jadoon showed about the 2019 into 2020 period, where this was the nadir of the organization. Rapidly, within a matter of a few months, tremendous rise from 3 attacks a month to 40 or so by the end of that 12-month rise period, resurgence period. So think through very carefully about, yes, pause could be partially a result, sure, of successful Taliban operations. Think through those considerations we gave you about what leadership targeting can do to an organization like ISK. But the Islamic State as a global movement has an insurgency method where when overwhelming adversary resources are applied, the group strategically shifts its resources, its personnel, and its operations to adjust and to survive through those periods of losses so that they can resurge on the other end. So yeah, we may be looking at whether it's a combination of strategic selection on ISK's part and successful Taliban operations. I would guess it's a combination of those two. I would certainly be prepared if I were a stakeholder in security in the country, in the region, for some kind of resurgence period, because that is what this organization has done for 9 almost years now. So there's nothing to suggest that this period is any exception.
One of the questions that we have here is the relationship with ISIS-K and the TTP. Are they rivals? Are they interested in joint attacks? How do you see that the relationship evolving?
yeah, that's an interesting question, which we actually get quite a lot. So with other groups, such as Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, the Afghan Taliban, Jamaat al-Ahrar, ISK has traditionally been able to form clean relationships, right? So you're either with us or against us. With TTP, it's a little complicated. So we have seen periods of when ISK there's just no specific statements made to the TTP, and you can see that there's clearly they're trying to avoid direct confrontation or direct criticism towards the TTP. Now, there could be various reasons for this, right? But two sort of come to mind. One is that ISK's formation, obviously its membership has evolved over the years, but its initial formation drew heavily from TTP leaders who defected from TTP and brought their entire factions to join ISK or to form ISK, right? And over subsequent years, we have seen a trickle from many other groups, but also the Pakistani Taliban to the ISK. So if there's such a heavy presence of former TTP members, you can imagine that there may be some sympathies and also individual level relationships. I think the second point is that perhaps it's not like there hasn't been any animosity between the two. There have been, but I think organizationally, we don't see the same type of rivalry which we see with the Afghan Taliban, right? And one key factor for this could be the fact that the Afghan Taliban, for example, are not opposed to the Pakistani state, never have been. In fact, they've been supported, whereas the common thread, which is a strong one, which ties TTP and ISK, is their very, very rigid stance against all governments, but the Pakistani government, right? That's what unites them. And due to that factor being so important for both organizations, there always remains the possibility of them engaging in more tactical cooperation in the future and maybe even strategic level cooperation.
Well, we have one more question, and I promised you 45 minutes, so I will ask it, and then hopefully we can wrap it up. And this is really a question about Iran and the relationship with ISIS-K, and whether they are blaming the Taliban government. Iran is blaming the Taliban government for leaving the borders open. So. What do you know about this?
So I don't have any specific information about the current relationship between Iran and Taliban, right? But what you can see, Iran has the same concerns that Pakistan does, the same concern that China does, same concerns that Russia does, right? And for example, when the Pakistanis have been very concerned about the Pakistani Taliban launching attacks. It does accuse the Taliban of not taking enough action, right? Or letting them conduct these attacks. So for Iran, if there is movement, and there have been 2 attacks, I think, in Iran by ISK, you can imagine that Iran is also using the same pressure tactics on the Taliban government to take this problem seriously. And every time we see other countries or the international community express concern about ISK, it kind of triggers the Afghan Taliban to crack down on ISK, right? So regardless, if there is ISK movement across border, which there is, I think the blame typically goes to the Taliban government because they don't have sufficient resources to consolidate their control, govern, and then also maintain border security, which other governments find problematic anyway. So I think that seems to be what's happening here as well.
Excellent. I'd like to congratulate both you, Amira and Andrew, for an excellent presentation. As I said earlier in the preamble, I really enjoyed your PowerPoints. Obviously, by the number of questions, great interest in this subject. So again, congratulations and thank you very much for presenting to the group. We'll make sure that the book and the links to the book are circulated to the audience and more broadly. I'd like to thank everybody for listening in. We went a little over our 45 minutes, but I think it was well worth the quality content. So thank you, everybody, and stay tuned for the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, for hosting.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.